Commission to order. We have one item on the agenda this evening. I will turn it over to Laura.
Thank you, Mayor. Emily, can you make sure I have screen sharing ability? I'm good. Okay. All right. Well, this evening, we are here to talk about our kind of continuing our work on putting together our comprehensive street maintenance program. And specifically, our focus this evening is going to be on trying to at least develop a preliminary action plan and action steps for renewal of our existing street sales tax. So this evening, what we'll do is take an opportunity to kind of review the current street program revenues, and our conversation tonight will sort of follow the format of the memo that was included in the packet on Friday. Review what the sales tax capacity is that's remaining for the city under state statutes, look at revenues that are generated by different levels of sales tax rates, and look at options for renewal, being either a mail ballot election or coordinating with an August primary or November general election cycle in 2021. Some talk about preferred timing of election, and then next steps. As you all are aware, since last fall, we've really been working on looking at the results that came out of the Stantec street inventory, and Celia and Brent's work on kind of boiling that down and trying to put together particularly residential street maintenance program that made sense. What we learned not long after starting the current street maintenance program was that some of our assumptions were incorrect because many of our streets did not have the sufficient base or asphalt depth to take the treatment that had initially been identified. And so very quickly into the current 10-year street program, we had to sort of slow down, shift gears, take a step back and reevaluate. So we've been doing a lot of that work since then in anticipation of getting to renewal of our dedicated quarter-cent street sales tax. Back in October and November, we've talked about kind of a target of a $2 million, identifying $2 million in funding to support primarily the residential street program. The program that we've sort of reached some general consensus around focuses on the repair of local streets with the lowest PCIs for the first 10 years, which means we touch fewer streets at first, but as we've talked about, we fix them right. And so this is a long game, and we're looking at less costly maintenance over time. So we talked about the pros and cons as we worked through previous work sessions in terms of going with a different cost benefit approach, which would be getting PCIs up and improving the overall PCI rating of the network more rapidly. But I think this approach that we've landed on seems to make the most sense. And I think that, as we've talked about, we feel like it aligns best with resident perceptions and expectations around the street program. We've also talked about coming up with a plan to look at funding our arterial streets, or those streets where we have cars and other outside assistance, separately. I included this slide in the presentation. Really, we won't go through it again, but just to sort of demonstrate and remind us of the work that Celia and Brent have done with Stantec and through our conversations this fall, and trying to put together those streets that would be recommended in the 10-year residential program. And I know Celia has provided an update recently on the work that's going on in terms of walking the streets that will be in the 2022 program, and beginning to get started on the design of that. And then again, this is just a map looking at the recommended 10-year CARS programs. We typically submit that on a 5-year basis, But we did take the opportunity this fall to build that out over a 10-year horizon so that we could more appropriately sort of align that with the residential street maintenance program. So we talked about this briefly in a work session in last October, and I wanted to just sort of cover again where we are with respect to our current street program revenues. And in the memo that was included in the packet, I also took the opportunity to kind of break each of those revenue streams down in a little more detail. And I'll highlight some of that this evening. But I felt like as we make decisions for the future that it was important to make sure that we all understood how we got to the decisions that we've made in the past, and why they made sense in the past. So currently we have the equivalent of 7 mills in the general fund that are collected and then transferred to the capital improvement fund and dedicated to street maintenance. Those 7 mills were established back in 2015. And at that time, 7 mills generated roughly the equivalent of what the transportation utility fee was providing. That was back in 2010, kind of the third leg. We had a 3-legged stool, if you will, with a transportation utility fee, a 1/4-cent sales tax, and then the special highway funds or the allocation of the gas tax that was put together to generate about $1.5 million that had been identified to fund the current street program. So what we've seen over time is that those 7 mills, which generated about $750,000 in 2015 equivalents, are now contributing about $1.1 million to the street maintenance program. So that the street maintenance program has certainly benefited from growth in the assessed valuation citywide. The 1/4-cent dedicated sales tax was passed. We did a mail ballot election in 2011, and that tax became effective in 2012. At the time, we were planning for the first street program and implementation of that. There was an existing 1/4-cent sales tax that was used to fund bonds that were issued for the expansion of the community center. So shortly after the community center originally opened in 1999, there was a thought to add the conference center space and an additional gymnasium. And so bonds were issued and a 1/4-cent sales tax was placed on the ballot to fund those bonds. We were reaching the point in which those bonds were going to be paid off. And through a series of sort of public workshops and public brainstorming and budgeting sessions, there was support from the community to look at renewing that sales tax and not allowing it to lapse and rolling it into a funding stream or revenue source for our street program. And then the special highway allocation as a portion of the gasoline tax that is collected originally goes to the state and then distributed back out on a quarterly basis to each city. So currently, when we look at the 2021 budget, we anticipate generating about $1,950,000 in revenues that are available for streets. Now that gets us pretty close to that $2 million target on the residential street side, but doesn't take into account what the needs might be to fund the arterial program. Revenues available for streets are currently used for engineering, design, construction inspection of transportation network improvements. So that's streets, sidewalks, curbs, gutters, etc. We also use those dollars to complete our inventories and assessments. So PCI ratings work similar to what Stantec has done, core sampling, etc., that assist in the development and evaluation of the street maintenance program, allowing us to evaluate and make changes as necessary. And then obviously paying for materials and supplies such as asphalt patch that our public works staff uses for repairs and maintenance that are conducted in-house. The special highway funds may actually be used for personnel expenses or operating expenses. And we have elected, since implementation of the current street maintenance program, not to use any of the street funds identified here to support personnel costs. Those are all supported by the general fund. So then we look at kind of what is our current sales tax rate. And again, this is something we took a brief look at earlier in our conversations, but breaking down our current sales tax rate in Mission by jurisdiction. So we have a total sales tax rate of 9.6%. But as you can see illustrated here, that the majority of that is actually state sales tax that the city does not ever receive. That's money that doesn't come into our coffers as revenues. Johnson County has a additional sales tax that's levied and part of that total rate. And then the city of Mission has a 1% general fund sales tax, the $0.25 for streets, which will expire currently on March 31st of 2022, and then 3/8 of a percent dedicated Parks and Recreation sales tax that will expire March 31st of 2023. As a side note, in the Mission Crossing development, which is Chick-fil-A, Culver's, that district, Cornerstone Commons, which is Natural Grocer, and then the Gateway Project, an additional 1% is levied through a community improvement district. When we look at how do we stack up in terms of a sales tax comparison with our neighboring communities, and there are more cities throughout Johnson County were included in the memo, but here I just took a look at those who I think are probably realistically our most our closest competitors, if you will, just in terms of proximity and where shoppers might go. So as you can see, we sit really at the top of this list with 9.6% matched by the city of Shawnee. Then we have Merriam and Roland Park at 9.475%, Overland Park at 9.1%, and Prairie Village at 8.975%. And then I think it's important to think about sort of breaking that down, because for all of these cities, they experience the same constant in terms of the state sales tax rate and the county sales tax rate. So the difference for us in many respects comes from the city rate and the capacity that each city has. And again, you can see we are currently with both our general and our dedicated sales taxes kind of at the top of this list. In the memo, I think the only city who is currently at their full 2% capacity allowed by statute is the city of Fairway. So the statutory capacity is actually 3%, up to 2% for general purposes, and up to 1% for special purposes. Sales taxes, as we know, are not only paid by Mission residents, but those who are purchasing goods and services in our city and live elsewhere. So it's been kind of an important part of the conversations as we've talked about sales taxes and made decisions to use sales taxes in the past, particularly for infrastructure such as streets, that we feel like it's a prudent decision to look at sharing some of that responsibility or spreading that responsibility among all who are using those assets in our community. One of the things that we look at in terms of what percentage of residents outside of Mission how they're contributing to our sales tax rate. We look at what's called a pull factor, and the current estimated pull factor, or the amount of sales tax that we receive that's generated by non-mission residents, is about 38% right now. Obviously, with the 7 mills that are dedicated, that responsibility for funding in the street program is exclusive to our residential and business property owners here in the city. So then we look at, as we think about what is the appropriate target, what are our revenues that are generated by sales tax? So I broke out, and I've added, again, I've added some additional options in the presentation here tonight over what was included in the memo. But sales tax can only be levied in certain increments, according to state statute. So when we break it down, kind of the options as we look at it, we look at kind of those that are shown here in this chart: 1/8 of a cent, 1/4 cent, 3/8, half, 5/8, 6/8, 7/8, and then a full 1 cent. And so you can kind of see, starting with that 1/8 cent, based on our current revenue collections, we anticipate that 1/8 of a cent sales tax generates about $300,000. And then obviously it just goes up sort of proportionately from there as you move through that. We are currently, as we've talked about before, sitting right here with our 1/4 cent, generating about $600,000 a year in dedicated sales tax revenues for that $1.95 million target. And so you'll see how that bottom line, or that total generated and available for street program, changes as we kind of move along this continuum. Currently, our capacity, our sales tax capacity with the existing 3/8 cent Parks and Recreation sales tax, we would be able to add an additional 5/8 of a percent. What I might do actually is stop here and maybe ask for thoughts or discussion before we kind of move into more of the mechanics of an election itself. Thoughts, feedback around the rate that we might want to move forward with for renewal. I think I have shared in previous work sessions that I feel like it's worth conversation around considering increasing the rate of sales tax and going higher than 1/4 cent, because I think certainly we can make the case that the needs are there to support the implementation of the street maintenance program. But we certainly need to be sensitive not only to the statutory capacity limitations that we have, but potentially thoughts about tolerance of voters and payers of that sales tax.
Laura, I have a question.
Yes.
On the special highway allocation gas tax, has there been any discussion about the fact that as we move to electric cars, that tax is going to go down over time?
I'm sure, I mean, there is some conversation around that. I think it's an awareness that exists. I think that will be a slow process. More traditionally, in the last 5 to 7 years, it's been a potential target as the state experiences budgetary stresses. They frequently look at ways to keep more money in their own coffers as opposed to transferring that to states. So even in its current configuration, I think our efforts in conversations around that have been more just advocating, and we generally include that in our legislative program each year, advocating that is an important resource for our cities and the state, encouraging the state to continue to do that. But, absolutely, as those sources that are powering the automobiles change, we may have to look at alternatives to that.
The other question I had related to the revenue on the sales tax. I've been seeing this year, especially prices in grocery stores and so forth, really going up. I don't know if there's been any information about that specifically. I know it's, since COVID, things seem to have gone up, but I don't know if you have any information about that or not.
I don't. So I won't even pretend to make
Okay.
up anything in response to that. I think, I think you're absolutely right. I think we're seeing in a variety of arenas. In fact, I was just listening to a news story the other day talking about kind of the surprise charges that in this COVID environment may be added to a bill, whether that's at a restaurant or for a delivery of food or other goods and services, that people are trying to just recover the additional costs that they've had to incur to kind of continue to operate in this environment.
Laura, I had a couple of questions. So in contrast, is one mil is about $160,000? Is that right?
Probably, a little, but probably closer to 175 based on the current assessed valuation.
Okay. So 175,000.
Mm-hmm.
And then my other question was, if we do increase the rate, is there, a staff recommendation in terms of your judgment of what the appetite might be? And then also, if we're talking about increasing it, does it make sense to broaden the category, within infrastructure so that it would include some of our stormwater work, et cetera, or just keeping it solely focused on the streets?
I have been wrestling with that question pretty significantly for the last several months, and I don't know that I have a specific recommendation yet, but I think it's absolutely worth the conversation. I think certainly as I think we're on solid ground as we tackle stormwater associated with a specific street repair or street maintenance project, that these street sales tax dollars could be used in that fashion. Okay. But certainly we know, as we're also looking at it, as we work on the asset inventory for stormwater, that we continue to have significant stormwater needs citywide. So we certainly couldn't use the street sales tax dollars to go repair channels or, tackle some of those other projects. So I know, and I, referenced, I think, in the memo that recently, just this last year, both the city of Merriam and the city of Roland Park were successful in passing sales tax initiatives for that broader infrastructure category. And in Merriam's case, it was a renewal of an existing sales tax. In the city of Roland Park, they actually repealed an existing quarter-cent sales tax and replaced it with a half-cent sales tax. And so their quarter-cent was going to expire in another year and a half or 2 years, but they had identified those needs and were successful in doing that. I think you can make the argument to a certain extent and on both sides. There's a lot of value in terms of being able to communicate with our residents, the transparency of dedicated, revenue streams and sales taxes. But on the flip side of that, there's, as we saw with this first street program that we implemented back in 2010. There are things that change over time. The conditions change over time, and being able to have flexibility while at the same time being able to sort of maintain and follow established priorities certainly has some appeal, right?
Mhm.
So if you were to, have a failure, and I would include in both the case of Merriam and Roland Park, park infrastructure improvements were also part of that street stormwater and parks piece of that. So I think, certainly just, we aren't talking tonight specifically about the Parks and Recreation sales tax, but that 3/8 of a cent was originally proposed as a 1/4 cent by the task force that had been charged with bringing a recommendation forward to the city council
Mhm.
to support the replacement and renovation of the outdoor aquatic center. And it was actually Council Member Quinn who, at the time that the task force was making that presentation, said, I've been sitting at this dais for years listening to the challenges that we have with upkeep and maintenance, particularly at the community center. And if we're going to ask for a 1/4 cent to have a brand new pool, then we should ask for a little bit more to catch ourselves up in terms of deferred maintenance on the community center and to give us the opportunity to look at amenities in our parks. And so that the council made the decision at that point to sort of expand that 1/4 cent recommendation to the 3/8 cent. And it has proved, while I think we aren't necessarily ahead of the game with the community center, we have certainly been able to make significant strides in catching up the deferred maintenance, at that facility. And as you know, we're looking now to kind of turn the attention in the next phase of that potentially to a focus really on our outdoor park system. So I do think in some respects, as we move into renewal of one of both of these, there's probably, I would lean toward a recommendation to, if we wanted to stay at the same sales tax rate, that I would ultimately probably flip these and go 3/8 of a cent for streets and a 1/4 cent for parks and recreation. That would give us a higher sales tax rate for a short period of time while they were overlapping. I don't know, as I look at, I would love to be able to say, let's go to a 1/2 cent on streets. But I would be concerned there about just the community's acceptance and tolerance of a sales tax rate, because I think that would really start to stretch us much further than our surrounding communities in that regard. When I look at the needs that we know we have in streets and stormwater and parks and recreation, I also don't think that we could be in a position like a Merriam or a Roland Park and go for just a 1/2 cent infrastructure sales tax, right? So I land probably somewhere, and we don't have an option between 3/8 of a cent and 1/2 cent. So, I think that's sort of where I feel like that there's probably that level of public support, but I'm interested in others' feedback. And then certainly, one of the reasons that I broke out the revenue streams is because, while we have to go to the voters for the sales tax and we don't really have control over the special highway revenues, the council does always have that degree of control over the property tax mills that are dedicated, to the street program. So those are things that can be flexible from year to year, or another way to look at supporting the program.
Yeah, and I guess I'd be curious, on if you think there's a difference in appetite between, a 1/2 cent sales tax or keeping, moving to 3/8 cent, but then discussing, a 2 mill rate increase, to get you to that same difference between the 3/8 and half cent, and then it's all on Mission versus the out of city participation, but that might be kind of too nuanced to try to explain in a, PR campaign, but.
Yes and no. I mean, I think people understand and have generally seemed to historically support the fact that we're trying to share that responsibility, particularly for street maintenance, with people who come into our community and impact the quality of our streets. And, as we know, just because of the nature of, a grocery store and a Target and a driver's license bureau and, tag division and county Northeast, offices where they're providing a variety of other services and, the restaurants that we have. We just know that, we're bringing folks into our community, whether or not they're spending sales tax dollars with us. We know certainly they are having an impact on our road and transportation network.
One of the concerns that I have is that we have this one coming up and then we have the Parks and Recs right afterwards. It's going to be tough to do one and then come back the next year for a Park and Recs. Is there any possibility of doing one for both? Is there any way to combine those rather than having to go out for ballot on both of them?
Again, I didn't set myself up for softballs, but thank you, because that's a great segue into another part of this conversation. I think there's the possibility for that. And I think we could explore that, particularly as we look at timing. I think we're much further along in terms of knowing what we would want to communicate to the public in terms of what a renewal of or what the next round of investments in Parks and Recreation would look like. But there, timing wise, we certainly have that opportunity. And let me, let me go on to the kind of the next slide as we start to talk about this a little bit. We did have, 2 elections basically for the sales taxes that we have in back-to-back years. Both were mail ballot elections. Both were successful. And I think both were successful in part because we had very strong targeted messaging around what residents could expect to see. And, that is what we will need, I think, in association with any renewal, regardless of how we package this going forward. In order to have no lapse in collection in a sales tax, so ideally we would have no lapse in collection. It would not necessarily be the end of the world, but I think you don't want people to get used to a lower sales tax rate for, a short window of time if you're going to come right back and ask for that. The last date that we have to renew the street sales tax with no lapse in collection is December of 2021. So we have to make a decision, about that at some point in 2020. We can certainly make a decision about renewing the Parks and Recreation sales tax at the same time, and or because there's no limit or restriction on how early you can renew that tax. So in theory, we could, go renew both at the same time. We could combine them. And I think we could, I would have to double check this, but I don't see any reason why we couldn't renew the Parks and Recreation at a different rate if that is, what we chose to do. But I think, again, the challenge is going to be, and as we even think about the street sales tax renewal, can we put together a coordinated, effective message around what we want to do in Parks and Recreation in time to do that, or or do we just wait until the next year? I mean, we need to. The same thing will be true in order to have no lapse in the collection of the Parks and Recreation sales tax. We would have to renew it by December of 2022. So we will basically be coming back like we did 10 years ago with back-to-back sales tax elections potentially.
Laura, I have a comment just based on history. I personally believe where we have either recently had a great success on something or maybe a need for additional help, those kinds of things resonate with people. Right now, with finishing Lamar and doing the great job our public works does on snow removal, getting something passed on streets is a really good time because people see that their money's being used like it should be. On the park side, we haven't put as much emphasis on that in the past. In order to keep it lively and efficient and people coming, we kind of need to market that we need to kind of focus on our park system. And that would be another way to get that through. In concert with those comments, we might want a survey to go out and see what people's thoughts are right now about increases. And if people in the past survey seems to really support our street systems, our parks and everything. This might be a marketing strategy to get that message out and how we're going to pay for it.
Right. So there's kind of two schools of absolutely. And I think that the other thing that I didn't mention and should was, we've been intentional over the last several months in putting together these conceptual design processes in our parks. We're through Mohawk, Broadmoor is in progress. We're working through those, but our thought was that that's getting through those processes and being able to take to the public this longer term vision of what we expected to see in the parks is something that would certainly help to sell, if you will, the renewal of that Parks and Recreation sales tax. I think the other thing is you're absolutely right. In the past, we've relied on information coming out of the Direction Finder survey, to particularly on the street side, to be able to go, and I think you saw that in the newsletter that was included in your packet. Very specifically, we talked about those Direction Finder survey results and that streets were the #1 priority for residents of our community. As we think about timing of this election, and again, Direction Finder is part and parcel of our comprehensive plan update process, which we know has been slowed over this last year because of COVID. But I think that we will be well served if we can think about timing an election such that we can get the Direction Finder out and not only ask the question about the priority of streets and or Parks and Recreation, but to ask some very specific questions about kind of that tolerance. How much would you be willing to pay, right? Because that, when the council converted, and Councilmember Crane, you'll remember this, when the council converted the transportation utility fee to those mills in 2015, there was a Direction Finder survey question that absolutely supported the community's sort of sweet spot, if you will, of how much more they would be willing to pay in that property tax mill. And so that helped the council feel very comfortable in part in making that decision to move away from the transportation utility fee, but feeling comfortable that adding mills to make up for that would be something that the community would support.
Yeah, I think, Laura, too, speaking of COVID, in addition to sort of getting a better parks plan in place, an advantage to waiting could be you're putting a little distance, hopefully, between, the worst of the COVID impacts on earnings, et cetera. And so rather than hitting people with everything at once, it might be better to have that year gap on the renewal of the parks.
What was the vote on the Parks and Rec ballot? I know that the quarter cent was pretty close, was 53% in favor. And you,
Yeah, I think 59, 53. It wasn't a landslide by any stretch. And I did, oh no, 53, you're right. I can look that up. I didn't look it up in preparing this. I believe that the Parks and Recreation sales tax passed with a higher percentage than streets. And I will tell you, I think that in large part was because you had a group in the Mission Marlins who were very strong advocates in the community, going door to door and with yard sign campaigns and a variety of other things for the replacement of that pool. So there was a big difference. And while certainly there was, support and information, there wasn't really that same level of, an outside group coming in to support and advocate for that. So I'll be happy to go back and look at that on the election board's website, but it was a higher percentage than what the street sales tax generated.
Okay, I was just curious because if it's that close again,
Right,
you don't want to go out and have to do it twice.
right. Well, and I think that's the thing. And I think that's the kind of the delicate balancing act of making sure that you try to cover, you ask for as much as you think you can get without running the risk of asking for too much. Because if you aren't successful that first time, coming back and asking for, that again is highly unlikely, and having success is highly unlikely. So again, as I said, I would love to be able to, ask for the moon, but we have to really kind of balance that. And again, I think that's where being able to time this election so that we could get the direction finder implemented. And I know the steering committee for the comp plan is getting an update kind of next week, and that will really kind of kick back into gear. And so part of our focus internally is going to be when, are we ready, coming out of the information that we've gathered through the website and the other data collection that's happened over the last several months. Are we ready to pull together those questions, for the direction finder survey? And I know several months ago, I asked you as a council and also the leadership team to sort of go back through the old direction finder and call out some of the questions that maybe wouldn't be important to you because we were limited in terms of size and page numbers in the direction finder survey, so that we would have the flexibility to ask some more specific questions. And I think, level of financial support for a particular initiative, because I think you have to ask that question. If you ask the question, do you want your streets improved? Everyone is going to say yes. You have to ask the follow-up question, how much are you willing to pay to have your streets, improved in order for you and for us as staff to be able to put together a program that's reasonable. So, this as we've talked about, we really have two renewal options for the sales tax. We can either do that via mail ballot, which is how both of the current dedicated sales taxes were put in front of the voters, or we can time it with another scheduled election. And in 2021, we will have both the August primary and a November general election date. It's about a 90-day process from the point in which you take action to pass a resolution to call the election. We publish the notice, mail ballots go out, election happens, election results are certified, you pass an ordinance levying the sales tax, and then you have to report it to the Kansas Department of Revenue. So obviously 90 days for the actual mechanics of the election, but we need to make sure that before we land on that sales tax question, we are absolutely prepared to know what our messaging and what that campaign, that informational campaign, is going to look like. I tried, and Councilmember Davis emailed me this afternoon when the presentation came out and said, can you do a slide that talks about the election board's timeline? And I told him I tried last week to make some sense of everything that was included in the memo, and ended up scribbling all over my page. So I do want to kind of walk through. So if you have the, I'm going to close this. If you have the memo handy, those last several pages really kind of walk us through the parameters that the election board puts in place in terms of timing for us to consider a mail ballot election. And after I first reached out to the election commissioner and he responded with all of this information, I sort of sat in my chair and thought, oh my gosh, it's like, it's sort of like threading a needle with all of these. You can't do this, you can't do that, it can't be this date, it can't be 2 weeks, here, there, and everywhere. But I think the options, as I look at it, and I think it's laid out pretty clearly, for mail ballot, the windows are probably June through the first 2 weeks of July, or September into the first couple of weeks of October. As I look at, well, and let me back up. So when I spoke with him, there's also a requirement, as I outlined in the memo, that the election board will not allow two jurisdictions to run mail ballot elections at the same time. And the city of Spring Hill had been in contact with the election board previously, kind of putting out feelers as well about timing for a mail ballot election. I did have the opportunity to speak with Spring Hill City Administrator on Monday, and they are no longer considering a mail ballot election in 2021. So I think if they are targeting, if they move forward with an initiative, it will be on the construction of a new justice center for them. And at this point, they are targeting the November general election as the earliest date that they would move forward with that question. So I think that opens up at least a small window of time for us now to be able to think about our preferred date. Obviously, again, we would have August and November. November is not my preference for a variety of reasons. One, because we have council elections in Mission, and I also think that it's past our budget cycle and past the budget season. So you don't have the opportunity to sort of react and respond if you were interested with any other sort of dedication of revenue potentially, at least for the 2022 budget. And then it also just bumps us up pretty close to that December 2021 deadline for getting this renewed. So June, I would say might be a little aggressive in terms of us being able to get out and have returned and have an opportunity to evaluate results from a direction finder survey. I think it's doable, but I think we would have to get on that next week, probably, maybe tomorrow, but very, 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 very quickly. And I think we're positioned pretty well to be able to do that. The question will be, I think we'll have a better sense of that when we get the update from Confluence on the comprehensive plan and can time that. And then, so obviously in either the August primary or a September mail ballot would give us a little bit more time to put that plan together, to get direction finder out, and to be able to incorporate those results into any final decision that we would make. The August date, although later in the game, and really June or August would give us the opportunity still to make adjustments in the 2022 budget. if we wanted to do that. September, we would be past that. But you could do, you could look at something in anticipation. So that's kind of, from my perspective, the window is fairly narrow with the election board. I don't know that there's a cost difference. I don't think that we can anticipate necessarily if we were to consider the August primary. I don't think it would take, I think 13, what did he say? 13 candidates would have to file for the 4 open Johnson County Community College trustee seats to trigger a countywide primary. And that's what it would take for us to realize any real savings in terms of conducting an election. So I think mail ballot versus, going with an established election date probably doesn't have an impact from a cost perspective in pulling together an election for 2021.
Let me be the devil's advocate on this issue of survey. To what degree would a new survey be any different than a prior survey that we have asked these questions? How much do you think that would really change in terms of people's opinion? In other words, we would be trying to do that in a hurry, and I'm just wondering is the juice worth the squeeze on that?
Well, I think we would be a little rushed if we were trying to make June. I think August or September would be probably a reasonable time frame with what we're going to move forward in this comp plan update process anyway. But I'll be the flip side of devil's advocate and kick that back, to you all, because it's really consistently in the Direction Finder survey, in every iteration, streets have been the #1 priority. I would assume that when we get this next Direction Finder out, that streets will still be the #1 priority. But it's really more your comfort level as a council in crafting and voting to put the question on the ballot about moving forward without that updated and refreshed information. The real value that I see in the survey is being able to ask the questions about that financial tolerance, as much as, what are your priorities, and potentially exploring, I don't know. I mean, I'm interested, nobody really sort of weighed in. I mean, I think Councilmember Flora, you talked a little bit about more general infrastructure versus dedicated, but I'd be interested to hear from others, maybe a little bit more about that, because I think that's the other question that could be tested via the survey, is kind of that community comfort level with, how targeted and how dedicated, how specific do you need your sales tax to be in order to be comfortable in trusting us to be good stewards of that resource.
I have a couple thoughts. I'm a little hesitant about the August primary idea, just from a turnout perspective. Those traditionally don't bring out a lot of people. And if we're kind of wanting to, have as much buy-in from the community on this as possible, maybe a mail ballot makes the most sense, just considering the recent school board election and last month, that was an impressive turnout, and also, trying to reach the most people here. Not to mention any lingering effects of COVID that may still discourage people from wanting to go vote in person on that. So I guess my preference, if we're going to have to pick a side, is potentially like a late September fall mail ballot might make the most sense from a turnout perspective and from a, reaching the most people. As far as, what to ask for on the streets, Debbie kind of made a good point there. I think everyone's really, anecdotally, I've just heard a lot of people have been impressed with kind of the recent infrastructure changes and improvements that we have been doing. I think there's certainly a willingness on my end to explore, maybe looking at a 3/8 on that question for the streets, just considering all the good work we have been doing. And now that we've invested so much time in the Stantec piece and everything else, there's a lot of potential to really make progress, especially when you consider that for many local residents, this is kind of their big interaction and connection with city government. So as we've kind of been talking about, it's probable that that's going to be the number one priority from folks again. The Parks and Rec question, I think maybe we can wait and see on that, kind of what we want to do to renew that, or what we want to ask for on that, I guess is what I mean there. But I also think we might be able to cast a little bit broader net on how we want to define to the categories for the streets. So those have kind of been my thoughts here the last few minutes on some of these topics.
I know, Laura, I'm the one that brought up the broader infrastructure question, but then the more we were talking about it and returning, to the level of funding needed for the street program we want to do, it does seem like, we're always, for the foreseeable future, going to need this money all for streets. So, I think if you think our message can be a lot better if we limit it to streets, then maybe it is better to just keep it the same, unless we think our message could really be equally strong talking about infrastructure. Or if we think things will be better, 5 years from now, where we want more flexibility. But I think looking at our street plan and all the work, staff did on that, it seems pretty convincing it's going to take at least 10 years.
Are there any thoughts, and maybe just from more of a sales side of it, right? If we look to potentially raise it to 3/8, would it make any sense to dedicate a portion of that to only smaller residential streets? I just think that people would maybe buy into that idea a little bit more, because I know a lot of the feedback we get is that people's residential streets aren't getting the attention. And we've done a really great job with some of the bigger projects, but we've all been down some of the streets in some of the neighborhoods that aren't in the best shape. And I think if we thought about that as, potentially looking to raise it, but also guaranteeing that a portion of that extra income or extra tax revenue in this case would go to specifically the smaller residential and side streets, so we could really work to build those back better. Just a thought.
I like that idea.
No, I think that's it's a really interesting concept. And I wonder, I've thought about, how do we do that? Do we do that with the sales tax renewal? Do we do that with the mills? I think it's really critical in this next campaign to be very deliberate and specific and intentional in communicating that the priority is those neighborhood streets, because we have made progress on the arterials. Those are important investments that we've made, and again, it was by no fault other than the streets just couldn't support the treatments that we anticipated that they would. So I think there's an opportunity to really look at how do we message around that. I mean, part of the challenge, and maybe that messaging gets stronger. We've talked a little bit about, and I didn't include anything in tonight's presentation about potential debt financing scenarios, because we've got to get a revenue stream in place first before we can do that. I think there are opportunities, particularly if we can get a revenue stream, if we can get that sales tax renewed. I think we've got, in this interest rate environment, some incredible opportunities to stretch and maximize any dollar that we bring in. And so, Bruce Kimmel is sort of chomping at the bit, waiting in the wings to, help us get a little further down this road, so that we can certainly, look at and take advantage of those things. And that's one of those things that we've talked about. If we can package that and really, accelerate the work that we can do in the residential neighborhoods, that would be a great opportunity. But I think certainly that it's worth kind of exploring how would we message that, or how could we kind of really communicate that commitment to residential streets.
yeah, and to Laura, to tie that interest rate point to the timing, I mean, I don't know if we have any sense of if those interest rates will go up at all in the foreseeable future. It seems like, from what I've read, they're likely to stay flat. But, is there any advantage from that side on, pushing for that mid-July, the later end of that first window for a mail ballot, to give Bruce, the time to work through those options while hopefully rates stay low, rather than potentially, a couple months later than that. I don't know if you have
Sure.
thoughts on that.
No, and he and I are kind of working through some of those conversations right now. I mean, that's the other consideration, and trying to run this gauntlet or whatever we want to call it right now, and do it as successfully as we can for the best, for the best outcomes.
So help me understand your discussion earlier about the combination of the Parks and Rec and the street program versus separate. What was your thought? Would you essentially raise the street to 3/8 of a cent for this year and then drop Parks and Recs next year? Is that the idea, or would it be combining the two this year and then not having a vote or election next year?
Well, I think if you did, I think you could do it either way. I think it would be, I think the cleanest way, if we were to do that from a voter's perspective, would be to basically repeal the existing Parks and Recreation sales tax early. And then figure out sort of what that combination would be. And if you think about, so the question is $1 million, if we were to do that, but basically end up with the same sales tax rate, right, that we have today, you'd be looking at that 5/8 cent. And so you'd be generating $1.5 million to be divided in some fashion between Parks and Recreation and your street program and your street need. I don't know that the mess, again, I think that the longer I think about it, the more I think the messaging around that is probably more complicated. And I think just that, I don't think our community has a reason to not trust that we will do what we say we're going to do. But I think the more convoluted you make your ballot question, the greater, the antennas go up and people wonder, what are you really trying to do with those funds? So I think for, essentially generating that same amount of money. So the question is, you would have to have that without doing something with the Parks and Recreation sales tax at the same time. You would potentially have to have, if you were going to consider increasing it to the 3/8 cent, you are going to have a higher sales tax rate for a year until you do something different with the Parks and Recreation sales tax. I had another question, which has escaped me, and it will come back in just a minute.
Laura, while you're thinking, I just wanted to third, I guess, what Nick and RC said about, whether it's through dedicated funds or at least in the messaging. I agree that hitting those, hitting the residential hard makes sense too.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we all agree with that.
Hey, Laura, do we have enough of a developed Parks and Rec plan to know where we want our sales tax to end up? So we're talking about maybe increasing streets, maybe decreasing Parks and Rec. It seems to me that you have to have enough a developed plan of Parks and Rec if you're going to make these decisions at the front end before that sunsets.
Well, I think generally defined really clearly with, you know, pictures and visuals that would help support it. We aren't there yet. And I don't think until we get through that, you know, the conceptual planning process for the major parks that we won't have that. I mean, we've talked in theory about just based on acreage and, you know, potentially limitations that are in place, whether that's at Streamway Park or Waterworks Park, that we kind of have assigned a anticipated, you know, level of investment in each of those parks. And I think we've been, you know, in conversations that we've had in the past, we've talked about kind of a $10 million target, probably for improvements and amenities in our outdoor park system. And then the balance would be, you know, where do we think we would be with the ongoing needs for maintenance at the community center and then the, you know, the aquatic center? Because right now, 50% of that 3/8 cent in Parks and Recreation is dedicated to debt service on the MFAC. So, you know, $450,000, $500,000 a year of that is, you know, is going to pay off that debt. So I think we could make a case. I don't know that it's a case that would be clear enough at this point, you know, for us to feel like we could confidently get the support of the community behind the renewal of that.
Right. Well, I'm not really speaking to a public facing campaign yet. I'm thinking more, do we as a governing body know definitively where we're heading on Parks and Rec, and the 10 million over X number of years? Have we decided that is the proper investment? Because these two things interrelate. So if you make a decision on one, you're kind of making a decision on the other. And are we, I guess my question, are we there yet? Not so much as a campaign to the public, but internally knowing strategically where we want to head on both of these assets, Parks and Rec and streets.
I don't think you're there on Parks and Recreation. I do think we're close on streets, and you're absolutely right. I mean, they are interrelated just in terms of, you know, where do you think that threshold is, you know, where we need to be in line with others from an overall sales tax rate. You know, I think we could spend every penny that we could get in either category, right? I have looked at it and really for the last several years thought, you know, as we move into this renewal cycle, it probably makes some sense to, if we want to keep the sales tax rate the same, to flip those. And, you know, because I feel like a little bit, you know, we were talking about the Parks and Recreation sales tax, that additional was added to kind of catch up for that deferred maintenance at the community center. We've made strides in progress toward accomplishing that. Again, not 100% there, but I feel like for the last 10 years, we've even added to that deferred maintenance concern on the street side that we knew existed when we put the current street program together. So I feel like it's almost this, rather than being more of an evenly yoked situation, right, where those needs match up and we kind of march down the road aligned with one another. I think they've sort of kind of, one surges ahead and then the other one catches up. And so it's a little bit of that back and forth. So I do think, you know, and we can certainly work over the next couple of months to make progress in trying to answer just that question. You know, are we comfortable? You know, do we want to make that? Do we want to make that shift? Do we want to make that flip?
Just a question on that. We still have time though on the Parks and Rec though, right? I mean, we're talking about that expiration a year after the
Mhm.
expiration of the current street program. So even, I mean, wouldn't we be able to kind of address the street issue first and then kind of still decide what our final messaging on parks and what our final ask would be, you know, well into the first half of 2022 even?
Mhm.
Okay.
You just, I mean, you just would have to know and acknowledge that if you think you're going to ask for the same amount, you're going to increase your overall sales tax rate by the time you get to the end of, you know, 20,
Well, and
2020, 22.
I'm
And
also,
that,
oh, sorry, I keep
no,
going.
that might be, I mean, I don't know, but that's,
You know, we talk about, you know, the public's interaction with our parks. I still think a lot of people probably don't realize, you know, we're going to get wayfinding signage this year. We're going to get, you know, new park signage. And as the warmer weather opens up, you know, as most of us have been stuck at home the whole time, could be more interaction there. That there could still be a lot more potential this year for interaction with parks that maybe we haven't previously realized before. So I guess I would be interested to kind of wait and see and just kind of see more how people are using our systems as the year progresses in light of those.
yeah. I did think of my question. So the one thing we haven't talked about is sunset. I mean, I've gone into this with the assumption that the comfort level of the council would be to ask for a sunset on the renewal of the sales tax. But it's certainly worth asking the question, I think, explicitly.
Is there not a 10-year maximum?
You could, yeah, you don't
You
have
can
to put
just do
a,
it.
Mhm.
Okay. I mean, I think talking about 10 years with a 10-year street plan seems to have some sort of logic to it.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think when I look at what our existing debt policy is, we do have some provisions in our debt policy that you know, sort of commit that we will strive to not issue debt for any longer than a 10-year period. So, you know, those kinds of things match up nicely. And so that's why, you know, if we looked at any debt issuance tied to a renewal of a street sales tax, we'd want to get that done sooner rather than later. So you would obviously be able to maximize that, you know, that whole period of time. You know, the only thing that you have that's challenging, and it's certainly not a challenge that you can't overcome. And again, I think what you see is, you know, the two sales taxes that were just renewed, both had 10-year sunset. So I think that's a kind of a public expectation in many respects, and it does create a, you know, a nice checkpoint. And I think that we will be better positioned. I think we felt a little challenged in this setting because we're having to wait. You know, we knew 2 years in, or maybe not even that long into the current street program, that we weren't going to have enough money to get, you know, to make the progress that we anticipated. And so we just kind of had to plod along with this process, and you couldn't make sort of longer plans or think about, you know, packaging a larger program because you didn't want to make that commitment without having the revenue stream to support, you know, a debt service investment.
What happens if the vote fails?
Well, if the vote fails, then you can go back and ask again. I have a question, and I don't think Brian and I were talking about this, and I think we both are thinking our Missouri, put our old Missouri hats on. In Missouri, you have to wait a specified period of time before you can put a failed ballot question back on for reconsideration. don't think that exists in Kansas, but I've got that question out to our council at Gilmore and Bell. And so I can certainly respond to that, but you would have to go back. And I think that's challenging. Again, which is why I think you want to, we obviously want to build in enough time to make sure that we can effectively message and inform and educate. Because if we had to go for it a second time around, I think it would be significantly more difficult.
But we could raise the mill.
You could raise the mill, and I think by the time you get to the end of this legislative session, you're not the rules are always in flux with respect to the property tax lid, but you have that. I think we're at the point where that would not require a vote in order to do that. But you could raise the mill to replace that, but you would be looking, and so you could do some combination, I think. But I think if you lost a sales tax election, raised the mill to replace it, and then tried to go back for a sales tax election, I would guess we would lose a second time around, because your voters, their confidence about, well, you're going to do it one way or the other, regardless of, what we do, or, and I think, honestly, one of the things that we haven't had the opportunity to message with the conversion of the transportation utility fee to mills is that the council has made this, firm, demonstrated commitment to street maintenance, because that $1.1 million that has been transferred and, has grown over time. And I think that's one of the things we could certainly do, is look at how much has been actually taken away from potentially being dedicated to general fund operations that has been dedicated to the streets. And you haven't asked for, we've seen, yes, people have seen increases in their taxes based on increases in the assessed values of their properties, but you haven't asked for a mill levy increase. And so to a certain extent, really every other operating department has effectively been sort of holding the line or managing expenses and expectations, because we've made that commitment. And I think we can even say, even in the COVID environment that we've been in, we did not back off of, when we saw the revenue, 11 and 12%, reduction in general fund revenues, we didn't hold back any of that transfer, for a street program. So I think there's some other things that we've done in the last 5 years, 6 years, that can also be very effective in helping us communicate. I also think, when I think back to the 2011 mail ballot election for this street sales tax, I mean, we didn't have social media. We didn't have, a much more interactive website. So we didn't have Emission Magazine. Our opportunity to sort of educate and inform was a newsletter that got mailed, to everyone's homes. And I think, I think back in October, we shared kind of some examples of, Miriam's campaign and Roland Park's campaign, and kind of their approaches. And I think our ability to reach voters in a different way it's kind of like a whole new horizon and landscape than what it was the first time we asked this question.
But in essence, what I think we're saying, the quantity that we need to increase for dedicated street program, if we do a 3/8 cents tax, sales tax, is $300,000 a year. Is that basically what we're saying? $300,000 a year is what we need, whether it's a sales tax or it's a mill levy increase.
Yes, I think that I think that plus, the potential of counting on continued increase in your assessed valuation to just gradually bump up that rate that's being dedicated. But, I think Celia would tell you that she'd be happy to take a lot more than $300,000. But that's probably, close to, yes, she says, as she logs on, 2 thumbs up, right? So I think we'll have to, I think we'll have to balance. I think we'll do everything we can to stretch those dollars. $300,000 more is going to be very significant. It's not going to make the implementation of our street program a walk in the park. We'll still have to be creative and very efficient in how we implement those dollars. Okay, well, you've all been relatively quiet this evening, but I think I have maybe enough input and guidance that we can come back and maybe give an update and get some additional direction at the committee meeting in March, if that's acceptable. Okay. All right. Well, if anyone has other thoughts, ideas, suggestions, as we move towards that March 3rd committee date, please feel free to pass those along and try to come back to you with a solid staff recommendation.
Well, I think that just in general, the sense that I get is committed to residential streets. We want sufficient amount to be able to really dedicate it to that effort. And whichever way it's going to go, whether it's as a sales tax or if it's a mill levy increase, I think that there's at least from my point of view, a general sense that that's where I want to put our effort.
I would also say, Laura, this has been such a horrible year in 2020. Putting financial barriers on people is really difficult, but we've got to look at some of the things that we have come up with, like the harvester's option. I mean, people can go get food 2 times a month now. The pantry is open. Those kind of things we're trying diligently, I think, to offset any impairments on people's lifestyle, because this year has been so hard on people. So a tax is a hard thing to swallow. I think you're going to have to really market well.
And I wouldn't disagree, which is why I watched very closely our 2 neighboring cities who had, ballot initiatives in 2020. And, to their credit, pretty impressive, results in both cases in terms of, support for the renewal of that. And I think, again, I think it's some of that messaging around, and, I don't think there's anybody in our community who can look back at this council's conversations over the last 24 plus months and say that investment in infrastructure and developing that long-term plan for maintenance of that infrastructure, which in turn supports the property values for our homeowners, for our businesses. It's been what we've been all about, right? And so I think people understand that even when times are tough, we certainly have to be sensitive to those financial impacts. But I think if with the right message, I think people will understand the sincerity and the rationale with which, we would be putting forward this ballot initiative. Okay. Does anybody else have any thoughts, comments, questions?
Thank you for doing this memo. It's very helpful.
You're welcome.
Good, Tasha. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
All right.